Woo!
Here we are.
Good morning, Maya.
8:20 in the morning. Good morning, Timothy. 8:20 Sunday morning. I hope that everybody has their coffee with them because once again, Timothy Langley is here to walk us through the major events in Japanese politics that happened during the week. So, Timothy, thank you for being here, for your persistence, and for the time you're going to dedicate to this briefing once again today.
So this is our 102nd iteration of Japanese Politics One-on-One, Maya.
It is indeed, and you look great.
Thank you.
So I can see that it's more or less like a birthday celebration.
So a lot's been going on in Japanese politics as usual. Let's get into it. Okay?
Definitely. Straight away. Yes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Tokyo, to Japanese Politics One-on-One, where we discuss every week and a compressed, I try and keep it to 30 minutes, briefing on what's going on in Japanese politics that should be important to you, that's meaningful. And this week is no different. Tomorrow, the Diet starts, a 150-day session. It is listed in the Japanese Constitution that the Diet must convene in January, sometime in January. They were going to push it back, but they pushed it forward to the 23rd, which is tomorrow. Let me see. The Emperor will travel across the moat and open the Diet session. I was in the Diet just this last week, giving a tour to some friends and colleagues. And, you know, if you've never been inside the Diet, you know what the Diet looks like. It's a large parliamentary building. It's split right down the middle by a main tower that's capped by a pyramidal structure. The upper house is to the one side from looking from the front of the building to the Imperial Palace. The left-hand side is the House of Councilors. It used to be the House of Peers. And to the right side is the much larger and more influential House of Representatives. And about 10% of the entire budget for the Diet when it was built, when it was finished in 1936, I believe, 10% of the entire funding was dedicated to only those areas that were touched by or used exclusively by the emperor when he comes in to visit from time to time. Actually, his responsibilities under the Constitution are very limited with regard to politics. He is required to open and close the Diet. He is required to accept foreign dignitaries and accept their credentials. But other than that, and you'll notice that the Japanese royal family has, you know, spent a lot of effort staying out of Japanese politics and staying out of the news. And I think that is going to continue. Politics has its own way of doing things. And over time, particularly over the last 20 years or so, the power and the concentration of power in the Diet has continually shifted. And right now it is pretty securely focused within the Prime Minister's office and the huge edifice that they have there. They've built a 6-story building there, the Prime Minister's office. Right next to it is the building that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, where actually the Prime Minister resides now. But it's 4 stories underground, 3 stories above ground. And that concentration of intelligence and smart people and just building that acumen in running a large economy is continuing. I mean, that's why they set up the digital agency under the Suga administration, so that they can have a purview of all of the things that are going on within all of the ministries. That hasn't been succeeded yet, but that is the dream of setting up the digital agency. But in the meantime, the LDP is also increasing in its strength and power. If you might remember, maybe 20 years ago when Japan was having a lot of friction with foreign trading partners, it was the ministries that held all of the power, and the Japanese juggernaut that was purchasing all of these buildings and real estate, and the spending money all over the advanced countries, the bubble years. That was a time when the ministries held a lot of power, and there's been a conscious shift and a drive to concentrate power elsewhere, so that elected officials had more power there. So we're in a kind of a transition. This transition will not stop, and it also indicates this drive for prime ministership. So it's winner take all in politics in Japan and in the United States as well. And in many other democracies, the difference between the president and maybe the Speaker of the House, or the whatever leader of the political party is, it's just distinctly different. The man on top, and particularly in a hierarchical society like Japan, the prime minister really is the position that everybody aspires to. So the prime minister is in a delicate situation, and currently our prime minister, Mr. Kishida, just came back from a whirlwind tour, 5 countries. He visited in Europe and on the American continent. He made a lot of progress there. I think if we can talk a little bit about what he was designed to do when he made his trip, and what he was able to achieve and what he wasn't able to achieve, will be instructive. But he just came back in time to start the diet for tomorrow. So with regard to his whirlwind trip, he had basically three objectives, and one was to secure the support for the Group of 7 agenda that Japan will push when Japan is the host in Hiroshima in April. The second thing is to securing support for explaining the 3 defense documents that they just produced just at the close of last year. You'll remember that they produced 3 security documents for the military, for military spending, for what their stance is with regard to China. And then the third thing he wanted to do is boost his own domestic support by being, seen in a global stage with lots of leaders, being slapped on the back. You saw this picture with him and Biden in the Rose Garden, being very chummy. These things really carry a lot of weight, and that was one of the things that he wanted to achieve while he was there. His first stop was in France, where, it's not a new flavor of the month. It kind of is, because we didn't talk about it. It hasn't been mentioned until just recently, but the 2+2, which is the defense minister and the foreign minister meeting on a regular basis. So the United States and Japan launched that, and Japan has pursued that. The United States has pursued that as well. And so one of the things that the prime minister wanted to do was establish more of those. He wasn't quite successful. France has a different idea of 2+2, but they did make an agreement on moving forward with that. He visited Italy. Italy is very interested in having the 2+2. And not only that, but the interesting thing with Japan and Italy is that they have decided to create a jet fighter with the UK. So the UK, Italy, and Japan are building a new age advanced fighter. And this fighter will be developed and sold to allies. So it gives you an economic push, a defense push. This is the first time for the Japanese to actually get into that kind of a construction alliance with an ally other than the United States. First time. So it's very meaningful. It's interesting that it was Italy that Japan partnered with, but I think this is a design of a bigger plan of bringing like-minded countries together to form this coalition against, what is a potential threat from China and Taiwan. I think that's the whole impetus for doing this. And then he went to where did he go from Italy? He went from Italy to France to Italy, and he met him in Rome. Where did he go? Oh, then he went to the UK, and met with the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. So this is the first time for them to meet as prime ministers. Rishi Sunak is also the new prime minister in England, and they signed a deal there that is really important and very unique. Once again, unique in Japanese history since the end of World War II. And this pact is for them to allow stationing of troops, Japanese troops in England, and also British troops in Japan. The status of forces agreement between the United States and Japan that caused so much controversy in the early 60s and has been the linchpin of the relationship, and why, American forces are so deeply anchored in Okinawa, has not been replicated by anybody else. The Australians want to get in on that, but the British were the first to close that deal. And so I think you're going to be seeing, like I said last week, the Japan that we knew of, 10 years ago is going to be quite different in 10 years' time. We will be talking to our kids and to our colleagues, and maybe teaching the younger people about what Japan was like, as we do today, as we talk about, you remember the bubble years, and it's almost an alien concept to describe what Japan was like during the bubble because of what the reality is now. So I think we're headed in that direction very, very rapidly. And the change, the components of change are going to be so deep and so widespread. And I'd like to get into some of those. So he finished with the UK. He went to Canada. He talked with Justin Trudeau. They had a couple of discussions. They didn't talk about 2+2, but they did talk about, energy and trade. And then he went to the big kahuna, Washington, D.C., and met with Joe Biden, President of the United States. They were able to ink a couple of really significant deals there. They had the 2+2 in anticipation of the prime minister arriving there. And then when the prime minister was there, then everybody was in the same room and they talked about this and that. And then they inked a couple of very important deals that I'd like to get into later in the briefing. But I think of the three objectives that the prime minister sought to achieve, explaining the defense documents that were just produced, firming up the resolve of his partners, the G7, for when Hiroshima happens in April. It's just around the corner. And then burnishing his image here in Japan. He was only really successful in the first two. And the third one, in burnishing his image, you can see that it really didn't go well for him in that particular regard, because they just produced a new survey that was produced just the other day about the population's appreciation. And once again, for the fourth straight month, the popularity, the approval rating of the Kishida cabinet has fallen this time. And the numbers are rather squishy, so it depends on who's doing the polling and when it is taken. But 26.5% approve of the Kishida administration. They have long said that when you're in the low 30s as a prime minister, your time is really coming up. You are in the danger zone. And this is, I think, by any extrapolation, the third month that he's been in the high 20s, 26.5. That's really, alarming, I think, if you're prime minister. And when they talk to people about, what did they like, what they didn't like, why is his approval rating fallen so much? The most negative issue by the population is that he's going to raise taxes, and he hasn't really focused on the prices of commodities. So taxes are going to go up, and in the meantime, the prices of all commodities has gone up. So in terms of the numbers, they said 50% of the respondents opposed the tax increase for the defense. So 2 or 3 months ago, before the whole issue was revealed to us, it was about 68% of the Japanese population supported defense spending. We're going to go from 1% to 2% of GDP. There was general agreement on that because of the threat from North Korea in particular, but also what was going on in Taiwan. When it comes to how it's going to be paid for, now people have a different mind. They do agree that defense spending is important, but that number has fallen down, and also the way to pay for it. So that's really really taken a hit for the LDP. So 24% are in favor of the plan for increasing taxes to pay for that. But as in a lot of things in Japan, 24% also had no opinion either way. Among the supporters inside the LDP, this is interesting, that 44% of the LDP is not in support of the defense spending plan that is offered by Mr. Kishida. So even within the LDP, it's not the majority, but it is a pretty significant minority that is opposed to the prime minister paying for the defense spending the way that he has proposed. And this has come up a couple of times. Mr. Suga criticized him. Mr. Hagiuda criticized him. Mr. Aso, Taro Aso, the deputy president of the LDP, and I think they're very close. You know, he's number 2 in terms of factional strength. You've got the Abe faction, then you've got the Aso faction. So what he says really carries weight. He said a week, maybe 10 days ago, in a briefing, that all of the people within the LDP, all of the members, the Diet members of the LDP, support the defense spending and support the way Mr. Kishida has promoted that it's going to happen. And everybody kind of blew up, and they said, who the hell said that? We didn't say that. And now this survey kind of proves it. So Kishida is being supported by Aso, but you've got this other faction that is beginning to really build up strength, that is led by Hagiuda, and it includes Mr. Suga as well. Mr. Suga went on he had an interview with Bungei, about 7 days ago, criticizing the prime minister. And this is rare for Mr. Suga. You know that he had, I think he was prime minister for 1 year. When Mr. Abe died, Mr. Kishida was the foreign minister, the longest serving foreign minister. And he did have probably the pole position to become prime minister. But for some reason, Mr. Suga became prime minister. So that created a little bit of tension between the two individuals. And that tension has done nothing but increase. Mr. Suga has kind of kept his powder dry. He was asked to make the eulogy of the slain foreign prime minister, and he did a really good job. And since then, he's been very quiet. You'll notice he didn't really criticize the prime minister. He hasn't said much. But in the meantime, a group is beginning to form around him, and it looks like he has decided that the timing is somewhat ripe for him to begin this. So he started with his interview in Bungei, and he said, it's strange that every prime minister, they almost invariably are the leaders of their factions. And every one of them in Japanese history, once they become prime minister, they give up the leadership of their faction. And Mr. Kishida has failed to do that. He's still the leader of his faction. And I worry, he was speaking or thinking out loud to the reporter, I'm concerned that his desire to promote those within his faction supersedes his commitment to the country, and to the LDP. And it's interesting for Mr. Suga to say this, because he doesn't have a faction. He didn't have a faction. It was rare and unusual that he became prime minister because he doesn't have a faction. And so he can throw stones at this mishmash of factions that determine LDP policy, because he's kind of not part of it. And maybe that's the reason why he has resisted to form a faction formally. So he is finding allies in Mr. Hagiuda, who had a meeting. You might recall Mr. Hagiuda he's not in the cabinet, he is in the LDP. So some would say that's a more powerful position than being in the cabinet. He is the policy affairs chief, probably the second or third most powerful person within the LDP. You've got the president of the LDP, who is also the prime minister. He basically offloads that work within the LDP to the Secretary General, who is Mr. Motegi. And then you've got a couple of other influential individuals there. One of them is Mr. Hagiura, who is the Policy Affairs Chief. So whenever I say, the Diet is going to go into session and the LDP has said they want to discuss and hopefully pass 60 bills during this session, that comes from Mr. Hagiura. He is the one that's supposed to be designing that. He's also of the Abe faction, and the Abe faction is still going through this turmoil. The leader has not been selected. There is a committee of leaders, elders, who are trying to keep the faction together. And within this coalition, there's jockeying for position. And it looks like Mr. Hagiura has the pole position. So you see him, he went to Taiwan maybe 3 weeks ago, a very sudden trip. He's really beginning to establish himself. He had a tax meeting on Thursday in the LDP headquarters. 60 LDP members joined him to discuss a new way of paying for defense spending. This is outside of what Mr. Kishida is doing. So once again, you're having this developing faction, and when you've got 42% of the LDP saying we don't agree with the prime minister's plan, it doesn't take much to tip it that this way or that way. So there is a lot of strong headwinds that are building with the prime minister. So things are kind of moving in place. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I know other people have too. There is this always this looming discussion about a snap election. Is the prime minister going to change his cabinet significantly? Is he going to call a snap election? And I think, as we discussed a little bit last week, it really is, it's unwise, it's inopportune, it's untimely for the prime minister to hold a snap election. He's got to maintain the pace of being prime minister until Hiroshima. So I think that in the background, he has the 5th largest faction. So, the other players he's got to really give concessions to. And you can see the inner workings of some of that happening if you're careful enough observing. So with a snap election, that would close down the House. Everyone would go back to their districts to run an election, and hopefully the LDP would end up in a better position after the election than it was before it started the election. That doesn't look likely with the numbers that Mr. Kishida has. So the other thing too is, and everybody appreciates this is that Kishida, as the leader of the G7, Japan is leading the G7 and gets to decide the agenda and gets to decide who to invite. And he is working on both of those very hard. And for him, as the leader of the G7, it's going to be happening in 3 months' time, 4 months' time, to be extracted and replaced with somebody else. It just doesn't look very good. So I think the better gamble, if you're thinking about these sort of things, is that Mr. Kishida will remain as prime minister, but he will need to be very careful with the other individuals in his faction, the other individuals within the LDP who have other factional strengths, and importantly, with the opposition party. So there's a couple of things that were happening somewhat behind the scenes this last week with diet deliberations. So for the diet to go smoothly, you have to have as little controversy as possible so that everybody's focused on, the bills that are being proposed. 60 bills, that's a lot. And in this diet session, 150 days, they're supposed to pass the budget for 2024. They're supposed to do that by, April 1st. And then they've got the local elections that are going to start in April as well. So the LDP wants to do better there. It wants to probably close the House probably after G7. And so people are going to be jockeying to place there. But first and foremost, the prime minister needs to make things very calm inside the diet deliberations. So the machinations that are going on in the background, the LDP was approached by Ishin, which is probably the 3rd largest opposition party. There are certain areas that Ishin holds as policy issues that are very close to the LDP policy positions. And the number one opposition party is the Constitutional Democratic Party. And the Constitutional Democratic Party and Ishin have issues of almost mirror reflection how they hold their position. There are some positions that they diverge on. And this meeting that was held with the leader of Ishin no Kai and Mr. Motegi, the leader of the LDP, the Secretary General, focused on those issues where there is affinity. And it looks like if there was agreement, we don't know exactly what the agreement was, but the two parties are going to start working together. And that is going to drive a wedge between the Constitutional Democratic Party and Ishin, especially when it comes up to these local elections. So this tactic, this strategy of the LDP to compromise some of the opposition parties means that in order for them to gather that, you've got to bring somebody into your coalition. The coalition is now exclusively the LDP and Komeito. And in another election, it could change, and that would change Japanese politics drastically. And these are the seeds that are beginning to show up now. So constitutional reform, how you pay the taxes, what you're doing inside the Diet, these are things that the Japanese, that the LDP is attempting to get concessions on so that the Diet can move smoothly. We can move into the general elections. You're going to get some of that, even though you're the opposition party. We're going to give you some of that, some of the ideas of coalescing jurisdictions we'll put to the side, and we'll give you a couple of seats that you probably didn't deserve or you wouldn't have won normally, and we'll give you a cabinet seat. So that scenario is looking like it's going to be more likely. The other thing that's complicating things is that Komeito, which is the political arm, some would say, of Soka Gakkai, which is the Buddhist sect, that has, a lot in common with the Unification Church. So people don't like to hear that. I'll probably get calls on that. But the Unification Church was building up their own political arm too, and getting into bed with a lot of politicians, not just the LDP, but mostly the LDP, and within the LDP, mostly those in the Abe faction. So that investigation of the Unification Church continues all last week. It is the evidence and the information is being leaked out. And so I think there is a lot of members of the Diet that are going to pay for that, because they're not going to be able to get full LDP support. They're not going to get full Komeito support. And I think some of the other opposition parties are going to be playing on that too. So I think we're setting up for a major shift in the Japanese political layout. So stay tuned to that. And that's the reason why it's coming to that kind of a scenario. So with the Diet starting tomorrow, if there's a lot of controversy, if they're really shouting, we want the Speaker of the House, Mr. Hosoda, formerly the leader of the Abe faction, to describe to us, he hasn't described to us yet, his involvement with the Unification Church. If we don't get that explanation, we're going to protest, we're going to stop Diet proceedings. The LDP is going to look weak and feeble. So that's one of the other things we're going to be seeing that over this next week. The other thing that's, let me see, what is my next issue to discuss with you? The talks with Biden and Kishida. So one of the things that has been somewhat, I don't know, it's strange and unusual. In typical Japanese historical fashion, Japan is very slow to move. It is very deliberate. It has a lot of conversations with people in policy circles before they make a move. And then when they make a move, just like in Japanese companies, just like Japanese society overall, things move in very brisk lockstep. Recently, though, and I think it's because of the geopolitical forces with the United States, with Korea, with China, Taiwan, that sort of thing, this coalition of like-minded countries, 2+2, the defense spending, all of that is becoming to hold a kind of an alliance of these figures. It's not like it was before. It's much tighter, and it's being created to be tighter and tighter and more robust in a lot of the things that you can see. So with Biden and the prime minister visiting last week, there were a couple of deals that were inked. So Japan has, ever since the Taiwan issue has really begun to flare up, it's begun to really mimic what the United States is saying and promoting in very quick order. And the pace is very quick. The United States in Washington, D.C. will make some pronouncement, and very quickly, within days, Mr. Kishida says something similar to that, and policy is moving in that step too. So there's got to be a give and a take there. Japan is spending far more for defense spending, and it's going to hurt the Japanese population, but they're going to do it anyway. Why are they going to do that? Why? What has compelled that without so much of a discussion? I mean, usually something like this is going to take years of debate, but it was just a decision that was made. And when you look at what Biden and Kishida talked about this last week, it gives you some indication that there is a bang with the buck. So if you accommodate us here, we're going to accommodate you there. One of the things that they inked a huge deal on was space exploration. This is a huge deal for Japan. They're laying a foundation now for NASA and for the meteorological agency and the space program here in Japan to join forces and to develop more space exploration. That means landing a man on the moon. It means space stations and satellites and, just really out of this world kinds of things. So there's going to be a lot of money and a lot of emphasis going in there. The United States, the space station is the result of, several countries, including, Russia, building this thing together. So I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are going to be much a part of this new wave of space exploration, but the Japanese are, and they're going to be at the forefront with the United States. That's one of the things that they talked about. So you've got that going on. You also have the export controls that the United States is insisting upon among its allies. This hits Japan at a particularly soft spot because what the United States wants is to limit Chinese access to a lot of things, particularly to making chips, the high-end chips, restricting them from doing that. They can make better products that they'll sell on the world market, just to kind of isolate them more and more. And for the Japanese, they build the machines that build these other components and devices. So for the Kishida administration to say, we're not going to be trading, with high-end products with China, Japan is not known, Korea is known, and Taiwan is known for building these high-end chips. Japan is not known for that. Japan is known for building the machines that make those things. So the U.S. administration wants the Japanese to stop that. The prime minister has committed, I will do what I can, but I've got Keidanren, I've got the business interests that I need to make concessions with. So that's coming down the path, and that's likely going to be the result, that the blockade of China with regard to Japan is just going to increase. The United States got its way. It's creating this blockade of China. It is wide, it is deep, and it is meant to deter the Chinese from making even more incursions into Taiwan and even into Japanese waters. So the tip for the tat there is, if the Japanese manufacturers of these devices aren't going to be making the robust sales that they had previously enjoyed, something's got to give. So we don't know what that give is going to be, but there's always horse trading, and most of it is usually under the table that you never even sense until a couple of years later. So I'm not suggesting that it's evil or it's bad, but it's just the reality of how things are done. Similarly, the United States and Japan also talked about immigration for Chinese visitors, for business travelers, and for tourists. And as you know, a couple of weeks ago, Japan instituted a 72-hour requirement for visitors from China to come to Japan. You have to have your COVID test. You've got to have, stay away from people, period. And it really hampers people traveling in. And then they stopped issuing these visas for certain segments. So the Chinese jumped to the fray, and they've stopped issuing visas for Japan. They just did this last week. So it's a tit for tat. It's an escalation. It's something that the Chinese are well practiced at. So this is beginning to increase and escalate. So who knows how it's going to pan out? I think it's just, a delicate dance that that the allies, the Americans, the Japanese, the New Zealand, the Quad are doing to tamper Chinese interests in securing a more viable option for taking over Taiwan. So there's a lot of movement going on there. At the same time, gosh, COVID is over. So the Japanese government has decided that they are going to downgrade COVID from the class 5 to a class 2. So that's a big jump, right? We were talking earlier about Japan being very deliberate and methodical about how it does things. From a class 5 disease to a class 2, that's at the same level as the flu. So that is the classification that the Japanese government has now decided that COVID deserves. So it also means that you don't need to have your mask on. They're reducing that requirement. They're coming up with the guidelines. Probably in March, they will be announcing that, which means that you don't need to wear a mask indoors, that COVID is something that we just have to live with. And it also implicates this issue with China. So the visas with Chinese businessmen and travelers, they hamper it to make it so much more difficult for them to travel. With these new class 5 to class 2, it applies also to China. So those restrictions will also fall. So maybe it's just a period of time and a kind of a testing of the Chinese on how they're going to react to that. But it is also like a little bit like saber rattling, just to kind of keep things, in tone so that the Chinese are not more compelled to deal with, the Taiwanese issue. So the other thing that I think the Japanese and the Americans decided on was this really epical decision on Open RAN. And you probably are not very familiar with it. Open RAN is this technology so that there's interoperability between devices and between systems between the United States and Japan and with other people that sign on to Open RAN. The Japanese and the US just signed on to that. This is a huge deal. So usually you have silos, that even within silos, you have silos. So the reason for the digital agency is to diminish or dispel, crush all of these silos that are held within the various ministries. So even if the prime minister wants to find some information or look for himself, or if there's an investigation of misspending or misdeeds, it is impossible for them to go in and to look for those files doing a data search or something like that, because each of the ministries has their own data service, they have their own algorithms, they have their own security protocols, and the digital agency is supposed to open that up so that the central government can manage and control and know all of the things that are going on there. I mean, the computers nowadays allow you to achieve that sort of thing. Open RAN is more at a global area, and one of the reasons why, for example, Five Eyes just doesn't take off is the cybersecurity issue and also just the leakage. And so Open RAN is an attempt and probably the first step of getting that kind of closure that if you're going to have a really truly strong alliance, you need to really be bound at the hips. And I think this is one of those things Open RAN will provide. So part of Open RAN is cybersecurity. Japan has suffered a lot. You don't read about it because they don't talk about it that much. But the cybersecurity attacks from North Korea in particular, but also coming from India, sweatshops in India and Russia, it's really a drain on the economy and a really big Interpol police issue. So I think that there's going to be great strides made there. This open RAN is a significant deal. So we're talking about, why Japan is doing these things, why they are in lockstep. There's got to be, some benefit that is generated because it will be painful as well. So those are the kinds of things that are going on. And I think on many levels, the prime minister's trip was successful. But I think at the same time, with his approval rating at 26%, that's really low. You also might have noticed the yen being at 128 to the dollar last week. We were talking, we were in the zone of 140 maybe a month ago. So that is a precipitous strengthening of the yen. And it also inflects on what's going on with the Bank of Japan and with Mr. Kuroda, the president of the Bank of Japan. On February 10th, there will be a introduction of the competitors or the nominations to replace him on April 9th, I believe. His term of office ends on April 9th. And this also indicates that there might be a change in policy. Mr. Kuroda increased the yield for the bonds, Japanese government bonds, and that really rattled the market. So the yen benefited as a consequence of that. So there's a volatility that's going on in the market. Whenever there's volatility in the market, you can anticipate that change is afoot. So things are in play that indicate that there is something larger going on here. The other thing that I didn't mention it when we were talking about Mr. Hagiuda and his talk at the LDP headquarters. They had 60 people there. One of the things that they were promoting was the yield on Japanese government bonds. It goes for major extent is for 60 years. So any bond that is issued by the Japanese government needs to be repatriated, needs to be repaid fully within 60 years. And the idea of Mr. Hagiuda is, let's take that 60 years and move it to 80 years. It's somewhat similar to the idea that Mr. Kishida had about the reconstruction for Tohoku. Instead of having it for 30 years, let's have it for 40 years, and then let's take that extra amount and push it into defense spending. It's somewhat similar to that. But for Japanese government bonds, Mr. Hagiuda has described that if we do that, if you extend it from 60 years to 80 years, that repayment period, that generates about 4 trillion yen per year. And that's the amount that Japan needs for defense spending. So that's not going to hit the consumers. It's not going to be much of an impact unless you are the government and you're holding 20 years more of debt. But that is the current proposal. And it also impacts on what the LDP is doing with the Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan is supposed to be independent, though the president is selected by the prime minister. So a lot is going on. February 10th is a day where we're going to talk. Actually, they're going to be presented to the Diet, the nominees to replace Mr. Kuroda and his associate, his attendants, assistants. No, what would you call them? Anyway, the 2 or 3 key individuals that are also in the Bank of Japan that aren't the Mr. Kuroda's position. They're not the president, but they're number 2 and number 3. That will be going on, and so we'll be able to talk a little bit more deliberately about what's going on in the Bank of Japan. But even then, that's the 10th. It's just around the corner. Today is the 23rd, 22nd. So there's a lot of action that we're going to be anticipating with the Bank of Japan, with Mr. Kuroda, with the yen dollar, and with what the fluctuation is going to be with the trade issues as well. So I think I've talked quite a bit. The only other issue that I would like to talk about that's pretty interesting to me, something of a sensitive issue, suicides in Japan. And the reason why it's a sensitive issue for a lot of reasons, a lot of psychological and just cultural issues, but it is a barometer of other things that are happening in society. And they just reported that the number of deaths for last year was up so the number of suicides for men between the ages of maybe 40 and 60 is up dramatically. Women have decreased in the amount of suicides. The amount of suicides in junior and high school has also diminished, but it's interesting that the number of men has increased. So in this last year, it's up 604 individuals. It's not a lot of people, but suicide is one of those things. It can be cured. You just have to give a shit. That's why people kill themselves, is because they're despondent, they're alone, they can't deal with the things that are going on inside their head, and they eventually take the ultimate action. But the number of suicides by men alone in this last year jumped from 14,500 to 21,500. So that's I'm sorry. They jumped up from by a number of 604 to 14,000. Grand total of all suicides is 21,000. I'm sorry, I misspoke. So women are down by 27 people this last year, and everything was kind of going down until 2019. And when COVID hit, then the numbers started coming up. So COVID is one of the causes of that, but also it's something to just think about, why the gentlemen particularly between 40 and 60 years old, they're not retired yet. Maybe they've gone through some sort of unemployment or working from home or something like that. But it is remarkable that this number has come up, and it is an indication of some illness in society and in culture and in business that is not being adequately addressed. Sorry to end on such a sour note, but that is basically, you're going to see policy issues directed towards that inevitably. And you're going to also see policy issues directed towards children and the falling birth rate. So apparently the Prime Minister has said, we're going to take extraordinary measures to address this issue. And you wonder, what kind of extraordinary measures could you be talking about? But I think mostly it is about, having, families' education needs paid for, or getting money if you do have children. Right now, artificial insemination is paid for by the government, as is pregnancy. All of the costs for that are paid for by the government. And so this incredible increase that the Japanese government announced this last week for the falling birth rate, I don't know what it's going to actually entail. I'll report on that as the details come out. But it's a big deal for the Prime Minister. He wants more children to be born. He wants more voters. No, I don't think that's the issue. It's just, the decline of the population also impacts on GDP and productivity and growth. So you're going to see a lot of energy and emphasis put on that. Also, the startup community, there's some news on that I'd like to get to perhaps next week when it turns out to be a little bit more robust. Maya, thank you for giving me the time to give a briefing, and I hope it was spot on and interesting, and maybe we roll over into the Q&A.
Yes, let's do that. Thank you so very much for this. And let's go to Clubhouse.
So for those of you who are on the audience, if you're listening to this on YouTube, the Q&A isn't available to you in any event. It's only available on Clubhouse, and that's not recorded, right, Maya? So
if you're on Clubhouse, it is.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
And where can you listen to last week's Q&A period? On Clubhouse?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you're not familiar with Clubhouse, you might want to sign on to it in addition to this briefing, because sometimes the Q&A is better than the briefing itself, right?
Well, sometimes it happens. Yes. We always have great questions, though. So, yes. Thank you for that plug, Timothy. Yes, we're moving to Clubhouse now, and we'll continue there with the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I'll see you on the other side. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.